Well, hey, and welcome to Theo's History. Today we'll be talking about America's second industrial revolution. So if you're ready to get them brain cow's milk, then baby, let's get to it. The question we'll be looking at today is this: how did the second industrial revolution from 1870 to 1914 positively or negatively impact the working class of American people? Now, you may recall that at the beginning of the second industrial revolution, it marked a time of high inequality with poor working conditions and low wages. This period was called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a period where we were rapidly industrializing and gaining immense wealth. However, only a few shared that wealth and there was widespread poverty for many. Or in Mark Twain's words, the Gilded Age is an age that is characterized by corruption but covered over in gold. Because of the poverty that so many families faced, it led to many children having to work in factories and other jobs that had very unsafe working conditions. Children were working in mines, glass factories, textiles, and these children ended up suffering illness, disease, and they missed out on receiving educations from having to work for over 12 hours a day. And not only were children taken advantage of, but African American people were also forced under the practice of sharecropping. Sharecropping was the system of a landlord/planter allowing a tenant to use their land in exchange for a percentage of their crop. However, it forced the tenant into a vicious cycle of debt, forcing them into unpaid and forced labor, just like slavery. And just to be clear, sharecropping didn't just impact African American people. It also affected poor whites. It was just much more prevalent and rampant against African American people, especially since groups and things like the Freedmen's Bureau were dissolved. Like I just mentioned, the Freedmen's Bureau, which after the abolishment of slavery helped and assisted tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people through providing clothes, establishing schools, operating hospitals, and more, was hit with tight budget cuts and deeply racist attitudes, forcing the group to dissolve and forcing more African Americans into sharecropping and poverty. One of the reasons why the United States was able to industrialize at the time was because of the huge workforce we had. The bulk of the workforce, however, was immigrants, and these groups were treated very negatively and were forced into lower paying jobs than their white American counterparts. Though this period wasn't all terrible, because as a reaction to poor working conditions and inequality, some large unions were formed to protect workers' rights. The AFL was formed at this time, and although they limited the additional groups they included, they did a lot for workers and even got legislation like the Clancy Antitrust Act to protect unions, workers, and prevent companies from using unfair business practices. At this time, the advancement and spread of technology also heavily increased. Previous technology that was not available to the working class was now accessible. Telegraphs massively increased in the messages sent and received, and community things like gas, water supply, and sewage systems were expanded. However, new technologies were still inaccessible unless you were very wealthy, with things like refrigerators, TV, phones, and more not accessible to the working class. Because of the advances in machines, factories became more efficient and began to produce items faster, which made goods and products much cheaper than before. And goods that enhanced the quality of life like shoes, clothing, household goods, and tools were more common and inexpensive. Now, in answering the question, how did the Second Industrial Revolution positively or negatively impact the working class of American people? I ultimately think that it negatively impacted the working class. The working class was heavily taken advantage of at this time and forced to work under unfair, unsafe, and absurd working conditions, whilst making the wealthy richer and they themselves stuck living in poverty. The large working class was also the only reason why the Industrial Revolution could have happened in the first place, and the only reason why there was such a large amount of innovation technology, even though they were unable to use and access this new technology. And more still, we were still excluding groups from the United States in whom we called Americans, with heavy discrimination against immigrants and even legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act being passed. Now that's all for the Second Industrial Revolution. Thanks for watching. Theo out.